You're standing on a beach, not a modern beach. There are no ports, no ships, no engines, no maps. You're somewhere in Southeast Asia more than 50,000 years ago. In front of you is the ocean, and somewhere beyond that horizon is land you've never seen. The problem is, you can't walk there. And humans haven't invented ships as we know them. Yet somehow, humans eventually reached Australia, and they didn't arrive there by accident once and disappear. They crossed a whole chain of islands. They established populations. They spread across an enormous continent. And they did it tens of thousands of years before writing, compasses, or anything resembling modern navigation. So the question isn't simply, how did ancient humans cross the ocean? It's, why would they even try? And what could they possibly have used to get across? First, we need to change the map in your head. Today, Australia looks isolated. There's Southeast Asia, then a huge stretch of ocean, then Australia. But during the Ice Age, the world looked different. Sea levels were much lower because enormous amounts of water were locked inside glaciers. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania were connected into one enormous landmass called Sahul. Southeast Asia also had a much larger connected landmass called Sunda, but there was still a problem. Between them was Wallissa, a region of islands and deep ocean channels that never completely became dry land. Even when sea levels were much lower, some gaps remained, and at least one of those crossings could have been close to 100 kilometers of open water. So lower sea levels made the journey easier, but they didn't make the ocean disappear. Humans still had to cross it. Researchers estimate that people reached Sahul by at least around 50,000 years ago, and archaeological evidence from Majedba Bay in northern Australia has been dated to around 65,000 years ago. That means humans were already making serious maritime crossings incredibly early in our species' history. But wooden boats don't survive well for tens of thousands of years. So archaeologists aren't going to find a perfectly preserved prehistoric canoe sitting on the beach with a label saying, Australia trip, Tuesday. We have to work backwards from what the journey required. And the journey itself tells us something. If humans were simply blown randomly across the ocean on a piece of vegetation, getting to Australia once might be possible. But establishing a population is a completely different problem. You need enough people. You need food. You need children. You need people who can survive after arriving. And you need to make the journey repeatedly. That's why researchers have argued that the first settlement of Sahul probably involved some degree of planning and watercraft, although exactly how deliberate the voyages were remains debated. One modeling study found that simply drifting randomly made successful arrival extremely unlikely on many routes. But even a very basic vessel moving slowly in roughly the right direction dramatically increased the chances of reaching land. The study concluded that humans had the capacity to make planned open-sea voyages lasting several days by at least 50,000 years ago. Which raises another question. How do you build a boat when you've never seen one? You start with something that floats, a log, several logs tied together, bundles of vegetation, a simple raft, something that keeps your body above the water. We don't know exactly what the first Sahul voyagers used, and that's important. There is no archaeological evidence proving that they used one specific type of prehistoric boat, but whatever technology they used had to solve the same basic problem: stay afloat long enough to reach land. And that doesn't necessarily require advanced shipbuilding. A simple craft can be surprisingly effective. You don't need to cross an ocean at high speed. You need buoyancy, stability, something to push against the water, and preferably a destination. The bigger technological challenge may not have been building something that floats. It may have been knowing where to go. Imagine you're standing on one of those islands. You look toward the horizon. Maybe you can see another island. Maybe you can't. Clouds hide it. The ocean is moving. The wind is moving. The current is moving. And you have no GPS telling you, turn slightly left. So how do you navigate? The obvious answer is, you look around. Ancient sailors could have used coastlines, island positions, prevailing winds, currents, the movement of the sun, and possibly stars. They could also learn something much simpler: where birds go. If birds regularly disappear toward the horizon and return later, there may be land out there. If floating vegetation repeatedly arrives from one direction, that direction might tell you something about nearby land or currents. And if people repeatedly travel between islands, the route itself becomes knowledge. You don't need a written map. You can carry a map inside your memory. And this is where generations become incredibly important. Imagine the first group that reaches an unfamiliar island. They survive. They find fresh water. They find food. They learn where the dangerous animals are. They learn which coast is protected from storms. Then they tell their children. The next generation doesn't start from zero. They already know the route, and if they cross again, their knowledge becomes more accurate. This is one of the hidden advantages humans have always possessed. A single human brain can remember a route, but a community can remember an entire landscape. One person knows the currents, another knows the stars, another knows where fresh water appears, another knows which season is safer. Put all of that together, And suddenly a dangerous ocean becomes a route. But there's an even bigger clue. The people who reached Sahul didn't just arrive at one beach and stay there. They spread. Archaeological evidence shows early human occupation across different parts of Sahul. At Mjbb in northern Australia, people were already using stone tools, grinding stones, pigments, and other technologies around 65,000 years ago. This wasn't a group that had accidentally washed ashore yesterday. They had arrived with technology. They were exploiting the environment. They were making tools. They were establishing themselves in a completely new continent. And that makes the original journey even more interesting. Because getting across the water was only half the problem. The other half was surviving after you got there. And Sahul was not exactly a relaxing vacation destination. The environment was unfamiliar. There were enormous animals, different plants, different climates, different landscapes, and no guarantee that the food you'd eaten back home would even exist there. So the first settlers had to adapt quickly. They had to understand new environments, find water, identify food, make tools, and learn which animals were dangerous. Archaeological evidence from Mjbb shows a surprisingly broad range of technological and dietary behaviors, including grinding stones, pigments, and plant processing. But an important part is that these people weren't simply passengers. They were problem solvers. Bilavi meaning prug procession. Bilavi meaning prug procession. Dulathanen. Bilavi meaning prug tapession. Bilavi meaning prug procession pil. Bilaravi de juhoridbi. But there's still one uncomfortable possibility. What if they didn't intentionally set out to discover Australia? What if some of the crossings were accidents? It's possible. Storms happen. Currents move. People get separated. A raft can drift, and researchers have specifically debated whether accidental drift could explain some early arrivals. But there's a problem with that explanation. One accidental survivor is easy to imagine. A viable population is much harder. You need enough people of different ages and sexes. You need repeated successful arrivals, and you need them to survive once they get there. That's why some researchers argue that the settlement of Sahul required deliberate voyages, or at least a combination of planned movement and opportunistic drifting. The exact answer is still debated, but the ocean crossing itself isn't. Humans got across, and they did it extremely early. So these one iso. There's another thing we need to be careful about. When we say ancient humans crossed oceans without ships, we're using the word ship very loosely. They almost certainly weren't standing on a wooden vessel that looked anything like a modern ship. And we shouldn't imagine them building a giant prehistoric Titanic. Their technology could have been extremely simple, but simple doesn't mean useless. A raft doesn't need an engine. A paddle doesn't need a motor. Navigation doesn't require a compass if you have enough environmental knowledge. And a voyage doesn't have to be fast. It just has to work. That may be one of the biggest misconceptions about ancient technology. We often judge old technology by asking, could this compete with modern technology? That's the wrong question. The better question is, could it solve the problem? And for the first people entering Sahul, apparently the answer was yes. Think about what that means. More than 50,000 years ago, humans were already living in a world where the next piece of land might be separated from them by open ocean. They had no written navigation manuals, no weather forecast, no satellite images, no emergency rescue service, and yet they kept moving. Anland by anland, coast by coast, generation by generation. Eventually they reached one of the most isolated major landmasses on Earth, and once they arrived, they stayed. The archaeological record at Mjbb gives us evidence of human occupation around 65,000 years ago. That single site doesn't tell us exactly which route the first people took. It doesn't tell us what their boats looked like. It doesn't tell us who was sitting at the front of the raft. But it gives us something more important, a timestamp. Humans were already in Australia, and the ocean was between them and the rest of Asia. So somehow, they crossed it. Maybe the first voyage began with a visible island on the horizon. Maybe it began because resources were running out. Maybe a group followed a coastline until the coastline ended. Maybe someone noticed that distant birds were heading toward land. Maybe they built something that floated and decided to try. We will probably never know the exact moment. Because the ocean destroyed the evidence. The boats are gone. The first paddles are gone. The first maps are gone. The names of the people who made that journey are gone. But their destination isn't. Australia is still there. And so is the archaeological evidence they left behind. Which means one of the strangest journeys in human history happened without a written record, without a preserved boat, and without anyone leaving behind an explanation. All we have is the result. Humans were on one side of the ocean. Then, somehow, they were on the other. And that may be the most impressive part. Not that ancient humans built something that could float, but that they looked at an ocean with another world somewhere beyond it and decided that the horizon was not the end of the map.